And so at this point, we are halfway done our biology unit in grade 10 science. We've talked about cell structures and functions, and we've also talked about how cells divide. And now we're ready to talk about animal systems. So before we can talk about organ systems in animals, we need to talk a little bit about the hierarchy or the levels of organization. And so we're going to start off, of course, knowing that all life is composed of cells, and that cells represent that singular unit of life that all living organisms must have. All living organisms must have at least one cell. Now, of course, if we're talking about animals, animals are multicellular, and so they're going to be comprised of a multitude of cells. And so when we take some of the same cells together, what we create is tissue. We could create a tissue, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about the types of tissues in the next section. But when we also can take different types of tissues formed by different types of cells and combine them, and when we do that, we can create what is known as an organ. And so it looks to me here how we're taking different types of cells, creating tissues, different types of tissues. And, in an organ like the heart, we of course have some muscle tissue. We have some nerve tissue. We also have some what's called epithelial tissue, and so on and so forth. And so those organs work together with other organs in the same organ system to create an overall and accomplish a particular task within the organism. So here we have, if we're looking at the organ of the heart in this horse, we know that there are other organs working in that system, like the blood vessels and the blood and its composite parts in addition to that, right? Okay, so now if we take multiple organ systems working together, then what we get is an organism. Okay, so these are the levels of organization in animals. Now, just as an FYI, I wanted to talk about plant cells as well. We don't think of plants as being organisms, but they are. A tree is a living organism. So if we were to look in the same way at plant cells can also group together to form particular types of tissues. And then those tissues, different types of tissues, can come together to form an organ. So we can think of the leaf as almost like an organ within a plant, right? Whose job it is to gather sunlight and produce sugars for the plant. And then we take a bunch of different organs together and we create an organ system, right? And combining organ systems, of course, is going to result in the entirety of that organism. So let's take a minute to write down a little bit about this, sort of in general terms. So we started off by talking about cells. And cells, of course, we know they're that singular unit of life. All living organisms are composed of at least, at a minimum, one cell. But then we take a bunch of cells together, and what do we produce? We produce tissue. Right? And so what is tissue? It's essentially just a collection of similar cells that perform a similar function, right? So for instance, you might be talking about, your skin cells, right? Coming together to form skin tissue. Now we talk about 4 different types of tissues in this course. The first is epithelial. And so epithelial tissue are basically thin sheets of tightly packed cells that act as a cover. So your skin would be considered epithelial tissue. Now, I think epithelial is probably the only one that's going to be fairly unfamiliar to you. You may already be familiar with it. The next one is muscle. Muscle tissue are comprised of fibers that contract and can cause movements. And so for those of you that are taking the exercise science course, you'll be very excited to learn all about muscles and how muscle fibers muscle tissue produces movement. The next is connective tissue. So these can be cells or they can be fibers that act as support or insulation. So a good example of connective tissue would be like ligaments, right? Blood is actually a connective tissue. Lastly, we have nerve tissue. So nerve tissue is what makes up, it allows us to conduct those electrical impulses so that we can send signals from one part of the body to the other, from our central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord, to the rest of our body, so that we can respond to a variety of stimuli. Okay, so we had cell and we have tissue. So if we take a bunch of tissues, different types of tissues together, we can create an organ. So an organ is essentially just a structure that's made of all these different tissues working together, right? So if we look at the heart, again, we have, that muscular organ. It has some muscle tissue. It has some epithelial tissue on the outside and inside. It's going to have some blood running through it, which is connective tissue. When we know that the heart beats based on nervous impulses, electrochemical impulses that are sent across it. So next, when we take a bunch of organs that have a similar goal, then they can work together to perform a particular function within the body, right? And that we call an organ system. Now, organisms, however, are made of, in particular animals, are composed of many different organ systems working in tandem with each other. We have, for instance, our circulatory system and our respiratory system and our digestive system that we're learning about this year. And those are codependent systems. Those systems depend on each other to sustain life for animals. So that is it. That's all I really have to talk about in this slide, just getting you primed to talk about our 3 body systems that I just discussed. But if there's any part of today's lesson that is confusing to you, or if you need any additional clarification, just reach out and I'll be happy to help you.